Hi, this presentation will be on brain plasticity, and you're going to learn about brain plasticity, what it is, how it occurs in the brain, and what you can do to develop your brain. Brain plasticity is the brain's ability to change throughout life. It confirms that the brain is not static and that it responds to circumstances such as learning new things. Brain plasticity is a physical process. Your gray matter can shrink or thicken. Connections within your brain can be forged and refined or weakened and severed. Brain plasticity refers to these changes in your neural pathways and synapses due to changes in behavior, environment, thinking, and emotions. It can also change with injury or disease. When we talk about brain plasticity, we can be considering cellular changes, such as from learning, to larger, more complete changes in brain mapping, which occur during injury. Brain plasticity occurs at the beginning of life, after brain injury to compensate for lost functions, and whenever anything new is learned or memorized. When we learn something new, such as a new dance, it physically changes the brain by providing new neural pathways that instruct the body on how to perform the step. When we forget a name, for example, it demonstrates that the connections to that memory are degraded and severed. This process of removing those connections that you no longer used is called synaptic pruning. And this brings us meaning to that familiar saying, neurons that fire together, wire together. Neurons that fire apart, wire apart. Not only does learning change the brain, illness or injury can also change the brain. Traumatic head injuries, strokes, and severe or prolonged illness can cause changes, depending on where in the brain the injury occurred. These changes can be manifested in vision, cognitive, or motor function. In order to best prevent these changes from being permanent, rehabilitation must occur as soon as possible. And in our readings, we have two examples. One of them includes a video where you see a 3-year-old girl with severe epilepsy in her right hemisphere that has the entire right hemisphere removed in order to stop the epilepsy. 6 years later, she can do most anything. Another example is a 50-year-old surgeon who suffers a stroke. He immobilizes his good side and uses the bad side to do all functions. Gradually, he's able to rewire his brain. Now he can read and write and even play tennis. Interesting fact. Your brain activity associated with a given function can move to a different location after experience, brain injury, or recovery. And this previous example with the surgeon brings that to mind. There's something known as positive plasticity and negative plasticity. When the brain, in response to a stroke, is able to when a person is able to regain some of their motor skills, given the time and attention, that process would be referred to as positive plasticity. Negative plasticity refers to changes that may result from an excessive level of neuronal growth, which is not beneficial. For example, a drug addict who craves a drug will be continually releasing neurotransmitters related to reward. This causes an excessive release of neurotransmitters, which may build neuronal growth, but in a negative way. And in fact, those new neurons can actually harm the brain. So brain plasticity can be positive or negative. Now, on the neuronal level, we can talk about brain plasticity. In previous weeks, we were talking about axons, and dendrites, and those electrical impulses that carry the messages through the body. We discussed the role of glial cells, which insulate those bodies, which make it easier to send the impulses. And when the neuron is successful and the impulse is fired, that axon fires neurotransmitters which fill in that gap between the two axons before the neurotransmitters join with receptors on the postsynaptic axon. So successful electrical signals result in the growth of neurons. And it's these neurons that form the gray matter of the brain, which then cause the brain to increase in volume. And this is defined as plasticity. If communication continues among the neurons, they continue to fire and produce neurotransmitters. If the communication slows and stops, the dendrites are no longer effective and die off, and we've already referred to that as synaptic pruning. Now, just as it's important to prune a tree, it's also important to keep the dendrites under control. This way there's room if you learn something new and want to establish new connections. Although plasticity can occur in a number of ways, the most important of these is called synaptic plasticity. So this one involves the release of neurotransmitters, which then activate specific receptors in that postsynaptic neuron. The synaptic strength is the amount of the electrical impulse that's needed to release these neurotransmitters. For the brain change to occur, the neurotransmitters must bind to a particular receptor, which will then allow the impulse to continue. With a stronger signal, there may be an increase in the number of receptors and their efficiency, allowing smoother and more efficient transmission. With stronger signals and more receptors, more impulses are fired and the brain growth occurs. So, brain plasticity relies on strong signals, which release those neurotransmitters, and then the receptors, which can take up those neurotransmitters, which increase the number of neurons. And this is called brain plasticity. Let's review what this looks like on the neuron level. So in this case, we have the axon with its message, its electrical message, going through the ends of it, going into the dendrite of the receiving axon. So this is the first area is called the presynaptic neuron, and the area that's receiving is the postsynaptic neuron. Inside the on the presynaptic neuron, you have vesicles that are filled with all those wonderful neurotransmitters. So when that impulse occurs, those neurotransmitters are released and they bind with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, which would be on the dendrite. So as we said, if there is an excessive amount of neurotransmitters, for example, someone that is addicted to drugs, then there may not be enough receptors for them, and those neurotransmitters just float along out there. And so that can be very dangerous to the health of the neurons. So when we already talked about synaptic pruning, so that is why it's important to keep the neurons under control. If there are too many dendrites, too many extensions that aren't being used, then there's no room for new ones. Let's look at an illustration that defines that. So on the left here we have a tree that needs to be pruned. It's got all sorts of branches going off in different directions, and if it's pruned it could be more efficient. The same on the right with an actual dendrite. So this dendrite has lots of connections, but if those aren't all being used, then it would be helpful to the axon to prune off some of these. And that happens in a natural way. You don't have to think about it, but that's how our brain becomes more efficient. So brain plasticity in the brain is seen by connections with more neurons. These neurons take up space in the gray matter of the brain, and brain volume increases due to these neurons. Changing your brain. So this kind of reminds me of a joke. How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And of course the answer is only one, but the light bulb wants to change. And so there it is with your brain. You can change your brain, but only if your brain wants to change. You need to invest time and attention. You need to adopt a plan, and you need to stick with it for a period of time. The more time and effort you put into this plan, the more likely it is that you will be successful. We've also learned that what a key ingredient to success in changing your brain is reward. With reward, the brain enjoys the change and it will continue to change. The bigger the feat, the thing that you're trying to accomplish, the bigger the reward. The bigger the reward, the bigger the change in your brain. So aim high when trying to talk about changing your brain. There are lots of examples of brain plasticity, and these are some of the examples that have been backed by research. For example, meditation increases the density of gray matter within the brain. Another one studied exercise and found that the exercise induced neuroplasticity, brain plasticity in different areas of the brain. There was a study that looked at blind people who can be trained to navigate using echoes, and that suggests that this skill is processed in parts of the brain related to vision and not audition. Another example is a quite famous example with London taxi drivers before GPS. They found that they had a larger hippocampus than bus drivers. Studies with bilingual speakers were found to have a larger left inferior parietal cortex than people that only spoke one language. Professional musicians who practice over an hour a day have a higher volume of gray matter than non-professionals. Medical students who showed changes in their parietal cortex and posterior hippocampus, and those areas of the brain are important for retrieval and learning. And then an example which we already discussed about a stroke victim in his 50s who was discussed in a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. And when his left arm was paralyzed, he immobilized his right arm, the good side, and then he set to doing tasks such as beginning with cleaning tables. Slowly over time, the quote, bad arm remembers how to move. He learned how to write. He even learned how to play tennis. And what it appears is that the functions of the brain areas killed in the stroke transferred themselves to healthy regions. Okay, and then finally, what can you do to challenge your brain? So like we said, it takes work and you have to really want to do it. So the first thing that you want to do is find things that are new, that will encourage new pathways in your brain. You want activities that are challenging and demand your full and close attention. You want activities that are progressive so that they'll keep your effort on the edge of your ability or the threshold of your ability. They should engage your entire brain, so make sure you include seeing and hearing and feeling and using this information. They should be rewarding, and the reward is what releases those wonderful neurotransmitters. And then these activities should be novel or surprising. Thank you so much for listening. And go out there in the world and do something to improve your brain.